The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back. You are comfortably zoned with me, the Zig Zag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland. And it is a beautiful sunny day in California. I'm a happy guy because I have a returning guest who wrote a book that we're going to talk about that I was so impressed with that years later I wrote my own book, and I copied a bit of your philosophy. Danny Peary, how are you, sir?
Ralph, it's great to be back. How many years has it been since I've been on your show? I was on it a few times, but years ago.
At least two or three, and I think about you all the time because I come across a book in my collection called "We Played the Game," and I'll explain it as I know it. And I intend to pay you the highest of compliments.
Thank you.
You composed a book that was so hard to write, the way I look at it. You took, why don't you describe the setup? Because I can't. It's that complicated.
Well, the book is, as you said, as we play the game. The subtitle is 65 players who played between 1947 and 1964, the Yankee dynasty years, and also the years that I grew up watching baseball. I was actually born in 1949, but that's my era. I was inspired, and if you remember, the introduction was written by Lawrence Ritter, who did the book Glory of Their Times, talking about previous eras where he went around the country interviewing players from bygone eras. And it's like maybe the greatest baseball book ever. And Larry and I were friends, and I wanted to pay homage to that book by going to my era. And I drove around the country like he did and interviewed 65 players from that era, not just superstars, but middle stars and stars who maybe guys like Al Kozar, who most people don't even know. But being a baseball fanatic, I knew him. I knew everybody as a kid. I knew baseball a lot better in those days than I do now. But like you, I still am an A's fan and whatever, and it's because of one of the players I interviewed in that book, Vic Power.
Oh, wow. Vic Power was perhaps one of my 5 favorite players growing up. He was a Yankee farmhand, am I correct? And,
you are.
And he wasn't brought up to the major leagues for all the wrong reasons. Vic Power was the slickest fielding first baseman of, I'm born in 1946, so right there with you, of our time. He was terrific. And
seven Golden Gloves.
Right. And what stopped him from being a Yankee was not only the color of his skin, but the fact that he had the gall, the audacity to date a woman, or perhaps even married her, if I recall correctly, who was not of his race, creed, or religion.
Well, so, he came from Vic came from Puerto Rico. And as he always told me, in Puerto Rico, there's no such thing as color. White, middle color, dark skinned, all mingled together in harmony. then he came to the United States and found out that was different. So he, when he dated light-skinned women, whether even if they were Latino and they just happened to have light skin, he would drive around. And you mentioned he was a Yankee farmhand. He played 1 year in Syracuse, so in the International League, then 2 years with the Kansas City Blues of the American Association. And when he was there, he was and he drove around in a Cadillac, by the way. He was stopped by a cop all the time. And when I say all the time, I mean literally all the time. And he would have his top down on his car, and he'd be out with his date. And as he told me, other dark-skinned players, the Willie Mazes and the Roberto Clementis, they would date light-skinned girls, except they wouldn't do it in public. They wouldn't go out in public with them, but he didn't care, and he went out and he got stopped all the time. And the Yankees at the time had no white players. They were being picketed by the NAACP and Latinos and black picketers wanted Vic Power to be brought up because he batted at Kansas City .331 and then .349, and they wouldn't even bring him to spring training. They wouldn't give him a September call up, and it was because of his skin, but also his attitude. They said George Weiss, who was a bigot, one of the owners of the team and the general managers, Dan Topping and whatever, they didn't want to bring up anybody who didn't fit the Yankee image, and they kept him in the minor leagues, and they never brought him up. And the two things, he dated white women, and when white pitchers threw at him, he didn't take it. He ran out to the mound and fought them, and they didn't like that either. So they traded him eventually before he came up to with the Philadelphia Athletics, who became the Kansas City Athletics, who became our beloved Oakland Athletics.
Yeah, I cringe over that. It's just horrible. And I know the Yankee lineup in those days like the back of my hand.
Yeah, me too.
Elston Howard was the first black. He was called up in 1956.
55. He actually 55. Vic Power should have been called up in 52, 53, 50. Well, he actually was 50, 51, and 52, 53. He came up in 54, but not with the Yankees. He came up. Elston Howard was his roommate, and he liked Elston Howard, except he said he'd always describe Elston Howard as a yes man, and he would never speak out about anything, but that's what the Yankees wanted. And Elston Howard was a good guy, and he became a great player. So, that's fine with Elston Howard, but Vic Power got shipped in a 13-player deal to the lowly Philadelphia Athletics. But that's when he became my favorite player, so I'm perfectly happy. And he's always said, I hit the Yankees better than any other team.
Okay. I wanted to describe your book and the difference between Ritter's book and yours. You talk to mostly non-superstars. You talk to, and I think from my years of interviewing players, I think they make the best interview.
That's why they also make. That's why they usually also make the best managers and the best coaches, right? Because they're thinking the game.
Exactly. I'll give you an example. Johnny Klipstein in your book.
Yeah.
Okay. He was so forthcoming and so knowledgeable about the times that he played, and that was the player that most impressed me from an interviewing standpoint. Mm-hmm. And when it came time to doing my podcast network, I realized you don't have to talk to the superstars to be successful as an interviewer. And as a matter of fact, I got more from the Joe DeMaestris of the world, the Art Ditmars, the folks that could look at it with objectivity, could look at the game with objectivity. Because a lot of the superstars, it wasn't the mental game. It was just a physical game with them. And they put very little thought or concern into what was around them. I'm not taking anything away from them. It's just that the world they lived in was different from the scrubbinos, as I call them. The Kozars is an example. It made all the difference.
I was about to say that it didn't ever come easy for these guys. They really had to do a lot of struggling. They had nothing on their side, and in order to make it in the major leagues and to stay in the major leagues in those days when there were only 400 players in the major leagues, it was difficult. And particularly for the black players, of course, because there seemed to be a quota on Latino players. But it was difficult for all of them. And if you remember my stories, my interviews with these players, and we play the game, doesn't start from the moment they arrive in the major leagues. It starts when they started out playing baseball as kids, and they were like a lot of these guys grew up in poverty or fishing towns or mining towns, knowing that if they didn't make it in baseball, they'd have to go work with their brothers and their fathers in the mines. And they had no money, and they just wanted to play baseball to make a living and to get out of the small towns that they grew up in, and to survive. And they had to do it on their skills, and they had no agents to back them. They had no real support, and it was difficult, particularly in the times that the ownership just had complete control over all the players. And if you didn't survive in one organization, you were still stuck in that organization. You couldn't go anywhere to show that you were actually worthy of playing. So these are the guys, who I talked to, and I chose them very strategically, from the different, they all played in different teams and their careers overlapped. And you said my book is different than Larry Ritter's, and it is that he just did the typical thing, just an interview with each player, and that would be a chapter. I did the book chronologically, so their stories would overlap with one another. And so if it's 1947, I talked about Ralph Kiner, for instance, and Billy Johnson, and the lesser players from 47, Johnny Sane and Spider Jorgensen, all these from different teams. And I would pick up their stories the next year, because that's how my book went from 46 to 64, 1 year at a time, and then I would have each player talk about that particular year. And lots of these guys moved around from team to team, and even the superstars were teammates of the guys who weren't superstars were teammates of the superstars. So I got the stories of everybody in that book. So
now,
I was very
what was really great, you had 2 or 3 players from each team, and you followed them along the way in addition to what you mentioned. So it was complicated in the sense that every year you chronologized each team. And
right.
I don't know how that idea came about initially.
I would like to. I think it was a good idea on my part. I don't remember when I exactly came up with it. I just remember, I did this book over the course of a year. I traveled to the West Coast, the Midwest, the South, And at the end of the year, I transcribed all these interviews myself. These weren't short interviews. They're like 5 hours long. People would meet me 3 to 5 hours. And you would not believe, Ralph, how big the pile of manuscript was when I had this. When I was finished with the 65 players, it's like this huge, like 4 feet of paper, just stacked up, and it's an epic story, and maybe that's when I think of it right now. I use the word epic, and that means there's a journey and a progression, and I think it worked best the way I did it because I wanted to have it. I mentioned before the Yankee dynasty, how it started in 47 or 49. Those people say 49 when Casey Stengel came in, but it ended in 64, and all of a sudden then the Yankees, who would win almost every year, didn't win anymore. And so I wanted to see the progression of how the teams changed through the eyes of all the teammates, the players who were on the rosters, and also the players who played against those teams. But just the interaction, we have the Dodgers and the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers players, and they're talking about that rivalry. Then I have a World Series chapter at the end of each year, and the two teams match, and it was usually the Dodgers against the Yankees, but occasionally the Phillies came in 50, as you know, and the Giants
a little bit
in 51 and 54. Yeah. So it was. I think it was just making the decision that there was a progression there, and it might have had to do, Ralph, and just thinking about it is me growing up as a kid, watching year by year, or every year buying the new baseball cards and reading the new Street and Smith or whatever magazine, and then going through that year, then to the next year, what happens then, and watching the Yankees. All of a sudden, the Braves emerge in the 50s and beat them in the World Series, and then 59, the White Sox, Dodgers. Just the changes that went on, and I like that, how some players' careers end, and then new guys I interviewed, their careers are beginning. So that all appeals to me, and even when I'm talking to you about it, I say, oh, this is a good idea to do it that way. So I think I chose right, and I think I'm the only person to do an interview book like that. So, and I think it's absolutely the best way.
Absolutely unique. And let me say that you did most of it without the benefit of the computer generation.
The whole book.
Right? How did you get your statistics? Excuse me, I'm sorry.
I originally, can you hear me, Ralph?
Yes, I talked over you, that's all.
Oh, okay. No, I wasn't really going to say. I was trying to remember I had this huge map of the United States, and I went through this book called the Baseball Address Book, and I found out where, all these players were living, and I tried to track down phone numbers or addresses, and I sent self-addressed envelopes. I sent envelopes with self-addressed postcards inside for people to return, give replies to my requests. So if I interviewed them, say I'm going to be coming to the South during this period of time. So I would have, a bunch of people accepting my interview request. So I knew there would be a bunch of people in the South if I went down to, actually I flew into Tallahassee, Florida, and I went all around Florida, and I went to Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina. So I did a lot of driving, and I'd call up people saying, are you available now or whatever, and kept contact that way. But what I find, if the most impossible thing I see looking back is I called a lot of these people, from like phones, people who I'd never contacted. And so I didn't already have an interview. I would I remember interviewing Bob Buell. You of course know Bob Buell from pitching for the Braves and being a Dodger killer. I think he beat the Brooklyn Dodgers 7 times one year. But so after I talked to him, I say, I'm thinking of calling Lou Burdett up. Can I say hello for you? He said, sure, say hello to Lou for me. So I call up Lou Burdett out of the blue and say, Bob Buell says hello. Could I come interview you? And he said, well, Bob Buell said, yeah, so come on by. So
nice.
The impossible part is I hadn't done the research on Lou Burdett. It was just going on memory and just talking to him and to be able to get the material I got from him and other players who I did the same thing with. That's pretty good because I did not have a computer to look up research, and I can't remember if I brought any kind of reference book with me, or if I was just relying on memory in those days. Because I know a lot, but there's a lot of stuff they talked about, which I learned so much in this book. I don't know how I asked a lot of the questions, but I should tell people, you're describing the book. I said there were interviews. It's actually an oral history. I'm never there. It's them talking year by year by year by year. So that's a difference. It's not me. There's not a Q&A. It's just an oral history where these 65 players tell the story of the era year by year.
And it isn't a statistical boring book. In other words, you don't talk about, it's mostly their lives. It's mostly what they went through. It's mostly being on the bubble. And for non-baseball fans, every Scrubino is on the bubble every year. You could be traded with no security. You could be traded or sent to the minor leagues or released any day. And I think the book captures that in the players' voices. It wasn't as much fun as being a superstar. Let's face it. But it was much more compelling because they would occasionally mention the superstars who they played with, and they could describe a superstar's situation better than a superstar could. Because, again, we talked about, they just get up every day and hit a pitch. It's not much thought process, and if the whole family has to be moved 3 times in 1 year, you could understand how a player is distracted, and it doesn't help their career if they're worrying about where's the wife's moving truck going this week. It doesn't help their performance.
Yeah, let me interrupt you. We mentioned Vic Power before, and he as I said, played in Kansas City. He bought a house there, and he got traded to Cleveland. He bought a house there. He got traded to Minnesota. He bought a house there and got sent to Los Angeles. And at that point, he said, we got divorced. It wasn't. It was tough. It was, and he was considered. He made 7 All-Star teams. He wasn't. He didn't worry about his being in the major leagues, but that just shows you anything could happen. He said, I wish there were. That's how bad the reserve clause was. You're just, anything can happen. You have no control over your career. But there are a lot of the guys. The guys I interviewed, even the star players, there was complete frustration with contracts and dealing with ownerships and having great years and then going in and trying to negotiate a new contract, and the owners and the general managers just seemed to enjoy gypping the players,
messing with their heads. George Weiss was famous for that.
famous, yeah. Buzzy Bavasi, all the Dodgers. They would the general manager would would call in the player to negotiate the contract, and the player would I want a certain amount of money, and the general manager would suddenly leave the room and leave a fake contract of, say, Duke Snyder or Jackie Robinson on the desk, and the player would look at it and say, "Oh, Jackie Robinson or Duke Snyder's only making that much money? Well, I guess I can't ask for what I really wanted. I'll have to ask for less." And those are fake contracts. I mean, these are things that the general managers enjoyed doing, and so almost every team, the Red Sox are known for giving money out, and the Giants, but not many teams were like that. And Ralph Kiner tells me, in the minor leagues when they wanted to be called up or whatever and get a better contract, the owners would say, either sign this contract or you're through. And he would also, and he showed me letters being called the communist. If you ask for more money, you're a communist. And that still goes on somewhat, but that's what would happen. They had no negotiating power, and that was part of just the frustration and being some of these players who you mentioned on the bubble, the guys who were maybe played in the majors and got sent down or trying to make it back or had bad reputations, so team wouldn't take them on, and they just wanted so much to succeed, but they couldn't get over the hump, and they just it was the frustration they felt, wanting to go to another organization to show that they were actually good players, or they were just beaten up by the ownership, or beaten up by the ownership in collaboration with the local sports writers. So it was tough. So even the guys who, major guys, most of the guys aren't stars, but I did talk to 4 Hall of Famers and middle and stars, and all the way down to the guys who were just hanging on. And I think everybody had a hard time. That's my own opinion, and including particularly the black players who. The white players said after Jackie Robinson, everything seemed fine for the black players, and the black players would tell me, no, it wasn't. They still had trouble.
Robinson and Pinson and those guys, they went through, and with all due respect to Jackie's minor league experience was in Montreal, where it was a different atmosphere for blacks. And the latter day is now not so latter. Like I say, Robinson and those guys, especially in the Cincinnati Red organization, because all their minor league teams were in the real Bible Belt craziness of the South. And
even Jackie Robinson, Jackie Robinson played in Montreal, but they didn't play only home games. They went on the road, and they went back into the States to play games, and he wasn't treated so well. And but all that seems that people forget. Spring training was all down, and all the exhibition games were done, and most of the teams still played in Florida, and it was tough down there, going from town to town, and even after Jackie Robinson had terrible times. They had to stick him out of certain towns, but Vic Power, he tells a story. This is one of you mentioned Joe DeMaestro. There's a Lake Okeechobee when Vic Power was in the Yankee or the A's organization. They used to play exhibition games, and they went to the team bus stopped at a gas station in Lake Okeechobee, Florida, and what the black players weren't allowed to use the bathrooms only white players were allowed. So Vic said he really had to had to go. So he bought a bottle of soda, and thinking that he could use the empty bottle afterwards, but the owner was like following him around, and so he couldn't do it. And then the owner of the gas station, he says, like 18 years old, Vic flipped him the deposit for the bottle. So it's like a nickel or whatever, and I don't know if it fell or whatever, but the owner was really insulted, and he called the sheriff. And Vic's story was just that, and called the sheriff, and they had to pay. The team pulled together money and just paid his bond or whatever, and they drove off safety. But Joe DeMaestri told me the whole story is they drove off and they got miles down the road. The whole team was the bus was stopped by all these rednecks with guns and badges and several cars, and they were all the players, all the white players, and there I think there were only a couple of black players. There was, I don't know, Hector Lopez was a player of color, and Bob Trice, pitcher, but all the others were white, and they got it. They all had to get out of the bus and put their hands against the bus, and they wanted to get the officers with quotes around it wanted to take away Vic Power, and you never would have seen him again. But there was some player who studied named Davis. I don't know his first name, but anymore, and I don't remember Davis. But says there was a player named Davis who'd studied law or something in college, and he negotiated with the officers, and they paid. That's when they paid all their money. They got like $500 and paid off, and then they drove off. And Vic never went to Lake Okeechobee again. He actually did not go on the road anymore. And after that, because it was so frightening. I mean, you can imagine that. That's how awful that story is. But that's what it was like for blacks in Florida, in small town areas and whatever, where they were not allowed to go into restaurants, and they were not allowed to go into bathrooms at gas stations, and so it was not an easy life.
Who of the players that you interviewed were you most surprised by what they told you?
Well, I'll have to look. It's hard. That answer is a hard one to say. I think, what I mentioned before about just the how the black players saw things differently than the white players. So what I'd be surprised about is having talked to somebody like Billy Pierce, the great White Sox pitcher, and and he seemed to genuinely care about the black players on the team, and said, but he was one of the guys who told me, I think everything was great with the black players on our team and whatever, and then I talked to someone like Mudcat Grant, who I got to know because of Vic Power. And he just tell me his whole story and just how basically segregated everything was. You could like the players, get along with the players, but the white players basically didn't have any idea what you were thinking and what your life is outside, and what troubles you're going through, and how you had to deal with the racism that still was there, and even the fact that your white teammates, although they're friendly and whatever and seem to care for you, would never socialize with you, and they never seemed to protest the fact that when you would be in a town in the South or the Midwest or Southwest, whatever, doing exhibition games or regular games, that the white players stayed in nice hotels, and you were sent off to the what was called the colored section of town, and you would stay whatever place they could find for you, either bad hotels or Vic Power said he stayed in a funeral parlor one night. It was very scary. Whatever was sent, and they would have to. The black players would have to walk to the training camp like 2 miles every day, and there were never any white players, on fighting for them. But I'm not saying what I should say is Vic Power had a lot of white friends. He loved Cletus Boyer, and Gary Bell was very. He did stand up for black teammates and whatever. But for the most part, that's kind of what I was surprised about. But you asked about what one player. It was basically that they were all the players. That all the players had contract problems, no matter who they were. I mean, Ralph Kiner with Branch Rickey when he wanted to, raise $100,000.
We lost without you, or we lost with you. We'll lose without you and not pay you. That's
yeah.
And
so he was a superstar, and so even if you were a superstar, you were at the mercy of ownership, and they could kill your career. If you were really good, that's great. If you got hurt or something, then they didn't treat you as well. I did a book on Roger Maris, and had the things that went on with him and the Yankees treating him terribly.
With the stand and what they didn't tell him the extent of his injuries, and they wouldn't tell him the extent of his injury to his hand, and he ended up really ruining his career. Not ruining his career, but his talents were diminished when he couldn't grip the bat. And
he couldn't grip the bat, but the Yankees were telling through the press, they were saying Roger Maris is just day by day. It's up to him when he wants to come back and play. So the fans thought he was, just leisurely collecting his money, his salary, and not wanting to play. And meanwhile, he had this broken little bone in his hand, and he had to go outside of the organization and find a private doctor who did an X-ray from a different angle than the Yankee quack doctors were doing, and they found the broken bone. So he went into, I guess Ralph Halk at the time was 63, 64, 65 when Halk was the general manager, and he said, "This is the X-ray. This shows that I'm really hurt." And Halk said, "Well, we knew about it, but we didn't really tell you, So that's the point. Roger Maris really wanted to leave the Yankees. He had no loyalty to the Yankees anymore. So that's how they treat players. Roger had the one good thing about Roger Maris, different than every other player, was when he would negotiate contracts. And this dates back to the 1950s. He came up in 57. But even when in the minor leagues, when he would ask for money, and then the organization would say, "Well, we'll give you, a $500 raise instead of the $3,000 raise you want, and we'll see how you do. If you have a good year, then maybe we'll give you that $3,000 next year," that kind of stuff. And Roger was the one ball player who would say, "No, if you don't give me that money, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go back home and work." And he was telling the truth. He was the one player who would get, we say players like to play for free. No player really likes to play for free, but Roger wasn't bound by contracts. He would have quit. So he always had the upper hand on management. He's the only guy, because everybody else would have played not for free, but for less than they were worth. And Roger never felt that was what he wanted was willing to do. But every other player I've ever met, got chipped on contracts.
And they assumed responsibility, had to, for that. Where if Roger Maris could deal with them, than anyone could have. They just didn't know it. That's the thing. I want to say something about Mudcat Grant. If you remember, because I interviewed him years after you did, and shortly before he passed away 2 or 3 years ago, and he was traded by Cleveland to Minnesota in between games of a doubleheader.
Oh, I didn't remember that. No.
Well, my point was the person that greeted him in the Minnesota locker room and made him feel welcome was a superstar, Harmon Killebrew. And
I will say Harmon's one of the people I interviewed for this book. He's one of the Hall of Famers I mentioned. And let me say, one of the nicest guys ever.
Right. He just took Mudcat under his wing for the first few weeks. And remember, Minnesota then was like Minnesota now. It isn't a liberal place to play or to live in. Let's face it. And I was very impressed with the idea that Killebrew was a human. And sometimes it's a simple thing. You're either a human or you're not. Sometimes. And let me just say, it's so funny, dealing with athletes, and I've done a lot of movie books and met a lot of celebrities, quotes around them, and I remember all the ones who actually would put their arm around your shoulder when they walk, were friendly in that way. Harmon Killebrew. I always remember walking with Harmon Killebrew, and he put his arms around my shoulders as we walked. And it was just the nicest feeling. And when you talk about with Mudcat Grant, we hear about Pee Wee Reese putting his arms around Jackie Robinson's shoulders to make him feel better when he was getting razzed by racist fans. But it's just a nice feeling that, and I can picture what you're saying. You put him under your wing. I can just see him making Mudcat Grant feel welcome in Minnesota, where Vic Power had been his teammate. I always gauge, I knew Vic Power really well, and I always say however Vic gauged a teammate or an opponent, I would go along with that. And he loved Harmon Killebrew, so. And Harmon Killebrew liked Vic Power too, so it's nice. So Mudcat Grant was in good hands. Mudcat Grant was Vic Power's favorite teammate. Vic Power they loved each other. So I loved Mudcat Grant, and he helped a lot of. Mudcat Grant was helped by Harmon Killebrew, and I think Mudcat Grant helped a lot of black players of color, including after their careers, who's getting endorsements and whatever. And he was much more than just a baseball player. He was a poet. And I remember in the 50s, maybe the early 60s, Sports Illustrated did a big article on him and published some of his poetry. And he was a very warm guy, and it's amazing how our conversation just went from Vic Power to Mudcat Grant and intertwined. Those people were intertwined, and this was terrific. I promise you I will reach out more than every 2 or 3 years and get you back soon. How about that?
Okay. It's always great talking to you, and we have to root the A's on to better things. What's going on with Oakland? That's what I want to know. Are they staying or are they leaving?
Bob Melvin is now gone. He's and
surprise. Bad surprise.
My prediction is that the next manager will be Ron Washington, who's now with Atlanta, has a good history in Oakland. He, as a matter of fact, so good that Chavez took one of his Golden Gloves and gave it to Ron Washington for helping him as a coach. So
I know Ron Washington, I read, wants to manage again before retiring. So, and Dusty Baker sure showed we can, at our age, Ralph, we can still manage, right?
Oh, at our age, we could do anything, my friend. Except the 100-yard dash. I think I've slowed down a little bit.
And come down to 10 yards. 10 yards at the most. Yes, but,
getting up in the morning is wonderful. And by the way, it's a privilege because by the numbers, everybody doesn't reach old age, and you got to do it eventually, or the alternative is worse. So, well,
what's nice is we've reached this age and we still have the memories, right? Those are the best things in our world. Yeah,
absolutely.
How important baseball was to us, and how it enriched our youth. It's just we're very grateful to baseball for the joy it gave us.
Baseball is letting down we fans, not just the older fans, but the younger ones and the kids. The kids don't get a chance to see World Series games. Where are they going to build their memories so they can continue this long after we're gone? I don't know. Maybe next time we could talk about the state of the game today. Far more depressing than it was in days of yesteryear.
Yeah, it used to be baseball. Now it's something else.
Now it's home run derby.
Home runs and strikeouts.
Right.
Yeah.
No more hit and run. No more get them on, get them over, get them in.
There's no more pitch outs. I've noticed that. No more pitch outs.
Good point.
It used to be a thing. And never that anymore.
Yeah. We'll talk next time about how it can be better. Not coming from a negative point, but what's going to make it better. And that'll be a great interview, too. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Ralph. Always a pleasure.
Okay, and we'll get your old phone to work just like before.
Okay.
We did good. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The guest was Danny Peary, and I'm honored, Danny. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ralph.
Talk soon. Thank you for listening, everybody. Happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.